I'm Stanley Iezman. I'm the chairman and CEO of American Realty Advisors, and today we're very fortunate to have Sabrina Unger, our managing director of research and strategy, with us to talk about the future of industrial demand and real estate from an investment strategy standpoint. Sabrina, we have a very big position in industrial real estate. And what I want to ask you from a strategy standpoint is two questions. Number one, why is there such great demand for industrial in today's world? And number two, which is the follow on, is what are the disruptions that we would anticipate that are going to impact industrial demand in the foreseeable future?
Well, the drivers of industrial demand are really a function of changing consumer expectations. So whereas, 10 or 15 years ago, if you ordered something online and it showed up at your door in 3 to 5 days, we were perfectly happy with that. Now, as consumers, we want things increasingly more quickly than that, right? So we think about it went from 3 to 5 day shipping to 2 day to next day to same day. And that necessitates retailers, 3PLs, users of industrial warehouses to be closer to their end users. And so that ultimately means greater demand in aggregate. To answer the second part of your question, though, which is, what are some of the disruptions we see potentially on the horizon? We really don't have to look that far into the future to see things like nearshoring and reshoring being an element of industrial demand going forward that we really haven't had in the last couple of cycles. One of the things that the pandemic showed us is just how fragile just in time inventory supply chains are. If anybody was left, wanting for toilet paper because it wasn't coming into their stores, understands how waiting for things to come, overseas, go through a port system, it's really fragile, and one link in the chain breaking can be really detrimental to businesses. So I think what we're seeing now is companies look to add redundancies closer to home. So I don't think we're going to see manufacturers completely pull out of places like China, Taiwan, but what they may try to do is replicate a part of their process closer to home, again, to try to create more of those redundancies.
So, when we're talking about disruptions, let's talk about the impediments of political pressure on in local communities because they don't want necessarily to have logistics facilities in their backyard. How do you handicap that, and how do you think about that from an investment strategy standpoint?
So the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard ism, related to industrial is very real. We are seeing markets that historically we never thought there would be any sort of moratorium or cap on new development. People are going to their city councils. They're saying, we don't like the truck traffic. We don't like the damage to the roads, the noise, what have you. And so what that means for those markets is there may be less supply going forward in aggregate. And what that means for investors and for managers like us is if we own assets there, they just became more valuable because there's not as much competition. It may also ultimately push demand into other markets entirely. So let's take the Inland Empire, for example. Vacancy, I believe, is sub 3% still.
Yes.
That's an area where a lot of these communities are saying no more. We don't want any more warehouses, for all the reasons I mentioned. And so if you're a user and you need, a big box, you may want to distribute from Las Vegas or Phoenix. So it's going to distribute demand into other markets. So in actuality, it's probably a net positive for the industrial space.
So, if what you're suggesting is that demand is increased for goods and services coming from industrial facilities, does that mean that aggregate demand is going to continue to increase over time and that we should be bullish on the product type?
Overall, yes. I think we are fully expecting the pace of e-commerce gains, overall consumer spending will likely moderate going forward. So that's certainly an expectation, but by and large, continued growth is still the outlook.
Is there anything that we should be thinking about with regard to industrial that we don't know that we don't know? I mean, is there something out there that you think could be impacting this that would be negative?
So, I think it could be disruptive, maybe not absolutely negative, and it sounds quite futuristic, but our longer term outlook on the sector factors in things like autonomous or driverless trucks, things like delivery drones. And again, it sounds really far out, but in reality, some of these technologies are already on the road. When we think about passenger vehicles, so it's slightly different than a semi truck, but what's considered level 2 autonomy, which is basically the car can drive itself. You just need to be in the driver's seat to get it into the garage. That already exists in mass, and there's a greater and greater adoption of that. In reality, driverless trucks may not be that far off. In March of last year, in fact, there was a truck, effectively this is a trial, and it was going nonstop for 5 days between Dallas and Atlanta. So over the course of 5 days, the semi traveled over 6,000 miles, made 4 round trips, and hauled something like 8,000 freight tons. Now, the same truck with a singular driver, it would take 10 days to cover that same mileage, to move that same amount of tonnage, right? Because the Department of Labor has limits on how long a single truck driver can be in the cab, right? And so we're really not that far off. It could be incredibly innovative. It's incredibly disruptive as it relates to sort of the relied upon patterns of demand when we think about specific industrial markets.
So you mentioned earlier drones and the idea of having delivery drones flying around and dropping packages off to your front door. We obviously watch the movies and we see on television drones flying around. How do you think this really works in terms of delivery of goods in the infill markets, or even suburban markets?
So, I will caveat being interested in drones and us thinking about it in terms of our outlook for industrial with the fact that I don't think in my lifetime we're going to look out this window and see highways of drones with Amazon packages attached going by. The reason I think that is, JD.com, which is a Chinese company, they're effectively the Amazon equivalent in China. They have been testing drone delivery of packages since 2015. And they're doing it in, the outskirts of Beijing and 4 other provinces, and they've delivered thousands of packages. But if you go to Beijing proper, you're still not seeing thousands of these things in the sky. They're really being used for rural deliveries of things like medicine and other sort of time sensitive items. So I don't think we get to a place where drones are completely replacing last mile sort of on the ground delivery. What I will say though is the FAA has become incrementally more friendly to this idea. So again, we're starting to see companies trial deliveries, but again, I think if we were to see it in some scale, it's less likely that we'll see it in cities and more likely that we'll see it in sort of rural or exurban areas first.
What do you think of automated robots delivering goods and driving down the street?
I think when we think about delivery robots in, whether it's an urban or, some other setting, part of it is whether the inhabitants of that city are friend or foe. Many years ago, there was a company that was effectively, they sent out a hitchhiking robot to try to make its way from Canada all the way down to Florida. It got about halfway and it encountered some less than, friendly folks, and it didn't complete its trip. Right. And so these things are expensive. I think people that are going to deploy these technologies want to make sure that A, they're effective, B, they can be returned to the store. So again, I think it's more of a niche function rather than something that we'll see in mass. Again, there are certain companies that are leveraging it. I know Domino's is testing out a pizza delivery robot, but it's on college campuses. So very specific use applications.
Well, certainly the fact that technology is going to enter into the utilization of industrial is probably one of the most prevalent conversations we're going to be having over the next 5 years, because it's going to shift everything. So I want to thank you for this, and I'm looking forward to another conversation about this in the future.